Hey everybody, welcome to Carbon Garage. Here this time we're going to look a little bit about some of the maintenance that you do on cars like the TVR. Thinking about things like scheduled servicing, but also some of the more routine things that you might do just to keep the car working how it should work. Service intervals on cars like this are usually a little bit more frequent than they are on more mainstream things. So you're looking at, I think it's 6,000 miles or every 12 months for things like oil change and filters, sort of usual routine service things along those lines. At the same time as that, you're going to want to look at a bit more of the underside of the car and do what's often called a spanner service, just make sure that everything's still as tight as it should be and that things aren't generally working loose. It's kind of just a sort of a routine thing on a car that's made in the sort of production volumes that these are, just to make sure that everything's sticking kind of how it should. The actual act of doing a normal service on it, and by that I mean things like changing the oil, changing the oil filter, it's a very simple thing to do. There's nothing that would stop you doing that at home. But to be honest, getting underneath it and making sure that everything else is how it should be is something that you really need a proper sort of 4-post lift to be able to do. And that really means that you're going to be taking it to some sort of specialist, and if you're taking it there to do that stuff, you might as well get them to do the oil and filters as well. There's not really any benefit in doing it yourself. And to be honest, on most cars like this, the value of the specialist stamp in your service book is worth significantly more than any money you would save by doing it yourself anyway. For the most part, this is quite an easy car to work on. There's pretty good access to most things underneath, and there's nothing overly complicated for most of the running gear. There's a lot of things though that are a little bit fiddly. I remember when I first got it having to replace or actually reconnect part of the windscreen washer hose, which runs sort of up from the front bumper area, up the inside of the wing and wheel arch, almost into the footwell of the cabin, and then sort of back up and through the little grille at the top. And that was a really awkward thing to do, is like bending bits of metal and sticking it through the holes where the wiper spindles are and things like that, just to try and hook it round. Again, it's a little bit of a side effect of a sort of handmade car, that some of these maintenance things haven't really been thought about the way they would be on a Toyota Camry or something like that, but it's kind of just what you would expect. So aside from your normal sort of oil service, there are some other things that I would say that you want to be doing on a fairly regular basis. One of the more obvious ones is keeping the chassis nice and clean, getting rid of any dirt that's building up there. Dirt has a habit of basically catching moisture. If the car's out in sort of the winter time or even just the autumn or spring, dirt can then trap bits of salt, which can then sort of accelerate any corrosion on the chassis as well. So by keeping it clean, you just help keep everything like that at bay, lengthens the lifetime of the chassis and generally keeps it looking nice as well. So I would recommend that you do that probably once a year. Just jack the car up, get it on axle stands, use a wash mitt, something like that, soapy water, same sort of stuff you'd use to clean the body, and just get under the car and just keep it all looking good. It's worth it in the long run. Another thing that I would recommend that people do is, especially, well, I suppose in any car, but especially in something like this, is just to make sure the brakes are always in like perfect condition. And what I would recommend with that is, again, jack the car up, get the wheels off it, take the bottom bolts out of the caliper, hinge it up, take the pads out, and just make sure the piston's moving in and out freely. Most of these cars are going to be doing a fairly low mileage every year. Some will be doing just a few hundred miles. The ones that are doing higher mileage are probably still only doing 4,000 or 5,000. There'll be some that are doing more, but they're probably the exception rather than the rule. So just by jacking it up, moving that piston in and out, you help make sure that it is moving freely. It'll help break off any corrosion that's starting to form. You can see what sort of condition the rubber seals are in. If they're starting to perish, you can replace them before the bore and the piston itself start to corrode, which will save you a little bit of money and a little bit of hassle in the long run as well. Obviously in a car like this, brakes are really important, so you want to make sure they're working as well as they can be, especially with it being so light. The thing with it being light is any brake imbalance that you get, like if the front left starts working more effectively than the front right for whatever reason, because it's light, you've not got that same mass and momentum pushing the car forwards, so it is more likely to pull if you get that. and that's a bad thing, especially if you're driving quickly or have to do an emergency stop. Things like the gearbox oil, diff oil, brake fluid, fairly similar service intervals to anything else of this type. So I think gearbox you'd want to do probably every 2 or 3 years, same with the differential, and brake fluid I would say sort of 3 years as per sort of best practice with any car. Something that I've not really had any bother with in this car, but it is a relatively common thing, is issues with the earth points starting to corrode. With any car that's not got a metal body, you're going to have certain points around about the car which act as earths. In most cars you can just sort of use any bolt in the body for it, so things like your lights will just, the wiring for them will probably earth on the bolt that holds the light into position, for example. But obviously with a fiberglass body, that's not an option. So you've got these dedicated earth points, and they can corrode. And obviously as they corrode, they don't work as effectively, and that can cause lots of weird sort of electrical gremlins to start creeping in. It's probably TVR's biggest Achilles heel, is just electrics doing weird stuff. Not helped by the fact that a lot of the time things like wiring looms, fuse boxes, they're borrowed off other cars and they're not necessarily perfect for the application that they're being used for here. Something to watch, especially if you're buying a used one of these, so you're not necessarily that familiar with the service history that it's got, is that because of the type of use that a lot of them get, they only get used on sort of nice warm sunny days. A lot of the things which you don't really need on warm sunny days, things like windscreen wipers, windscreen washer pumps, things like that, tend not to get the sort of care and maintenance that they otherwise might. But they can still break, as any component can. Rubbers perish, things corrode, so pumps can fail. Similar like when I first got this, I was saying earlier with the washer hose not working right. I still don't actually know for sure what was actually wrong with that. I just know I was pulling the stock, I could hear the pump go, but water wasn't making it to the nozzles. And when I investigated it, it was one of these things where every part along the way seemed to be working. I ended up replacing a length of hose, but there didn't seem to be anything wrong. The only thing that I don't know is whether that hose was actually connected properly sort of in that scuttle area. It's hard to say, but it's a good example of something that just wasn't really necessary with the use the car was getting, and it was kind of just allowed to go to ruin, which isn't ideal. So it's worth keeping on top of things like that, even if you're not using them as part of the normal use of the car. Keep on top of these things. It's the best way, rather than having all of a sudden 20% of your car being broken and you just don't really know or care about it. Although these are specialist cars and some of their servicing needs are a little bit specialist, you don't really need any specialist tools or equipment to take good care of them, at least not for the most part. So I think any sort of home mechanic should be reasonably comfortable doing sort of most routine things with them, which is good. I think it's pretty important as well that if you do want to buy a car like this, you have to be the sort of person who's got reasonable mechanical knowledge. You need to be able to work a set of spanners basically. You probably want to be reasonably comfortable with a multimeter as well, and you probably want to be prepared to spend a bit of time looking at wiring diagrams, just trying to understand how things were theoretically meant to work, and then spending a bit of time figuring out how on your particular car they in fact actually do work. I think if you've not got those skills, or at least an interest in those areas, I can very quickly see it being quite a frustrating car to own, because as I said in a previous video, you'll just constantly find yourself taking it to garages to get work done, and the type of garage you want to take it to isn't the sort of place which is going to have availability the next day. You're probably going to have, especially during the summer, 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 weeks of lead time before they'll actually be able to take a look at it. So really you want to try and avoid taking it there for things that aren't absolutely essential for them to work with. We talked a little bit about parts availability in another video, but I'll cover it in a bit more detail this time. So I think there's really 2 key suppliers of parts in the UK, and there are more, but I think these are the 2 that are really sort of dominating the market. The first one is TVR Parts Limited, which is probably the one that most new owners are more likely to go to, because they are the people now who are the official supplier of parts. So they're the ones that you'll buy a new whatever it is, and it'll come in a little bag that says TVR genuine parts on it. And there's something sort of reassuring about knowing that your car's got genuine parts. The other major supplier is Power's Performance, or as they were previously known, TVR Power. And TVR Power's origins are actually with TVR themselves. They were the company or division that did a lot of the work on the engines, well, all the work on the engines. They were behind the Speed 6 and AJP engines and things like that. And they remained an independent business when the TVR factory itself stopped making cars, and they started supplying pretty much every part for them. So although the genuine part scheme are trying to get into a situation where you can buy any part for essentially any modern TVR, and to be honest, they're pretty much there, so is Power's Performance. So you've got two big companies competing with each other, which is, as a consumer, what you always want. You don't want a monopoly for things like parts. You've got two companies competing with each other, and the two of them independently cover pretty much 90-95% of the parts on these cars, and easily 100% of all the things that, as a sort of matter of routine maintenance or repair, need replaced. To give an idea of some running costs, I think a minor service at the specialist I use is around about £400, something in that general region, and you're probably looking at about £600 for the major one. Following the service schedule, you're alternating between them each year, so you'll have a minor service, then a major service, then a minor again. The general advice that I've got, especially with the sort of mileage that I'm doing, which is maybe 2,000 to 3,000 miles a year, maybe slightly less, is it's just not worth getting the major service done that often, because things like spark plugs and even your oil, they're just not degrading in that sort of mileage. And, you know, spark plugs these days are made to higher standards than they were in the past as well. So you buy a new Ford Focus, Ford Mondeo, Toyota Camry, something like that, you're potentially getting 100,000, maybe even 200,000 miles out of a set of spark plugs. So to change them every 1,500, 2,000 miles in this is kind of just crazy. It's just not necessary. I think TVR started a trend in having headlight bulbs, which are kind of hard to replace. So most cars of this age, you would open the bonnet, unscrew a little cap on the back of the headlight, unpop the bulb, pop the new one in, reconnect the wiring, and that would be all that's required. Very simple job, anyone could do it at the side of the road, no tools, no special skills required. Obviously most cars you buy these days, especially those with HID, Xenon, LED lights, they're much harder. Often things like the front bumper has to come off, and it can be hours of labour at a dealership to change a headlight bulb. It's not quite that bad in the Chimaera, but it's only marginally better. You have to jack the car up, take the wheel off, carefully cut around a little bit of silicone, remove a little access panel, replace the bulb, and then obviously put that panel back on, redo the silicone around about it, put the wheel back on. It's a bit of a faff. It is something you can do at home, but it's definitely harder than it had to be. But just with the design of these headlights, you know, you can understand why it's done like that, because doing it any other way would have been pretty difficult. It would have required changes to the molds, and you would have started losing the structural integrity of it, and it just generally would have been awkward. I think that's everything we've got to cover this time on Carbon Garage. Hope they found this video interesting. As always, please feel free to add comments below. Let me know what sort of things you want to see, whether it's with this car, whether it's with the Abarth, whether it's with the MX-5s. Tell me what sort of content you like, and we'll try and sort of steer it towards that. Obviously, if you liked it, please click like. If you didn't like it, then go away. And if you want to make sure you don't miss out on similar content going forwards, then click that subscribe button and look forward to some more stuff. Thanks guys, see you soon.